It's always interesting that God knows what we need when we need it. And sometimes what we need is a slap in the back of the head. And we don't like that. So as you're going throughout life, you may have certain times in your life where you say, well, this is a busy season. And there are certain professions that makes sense. Farmers, we know planting and harvest is a busy season. We know accountants, tax time is a busy season. We know those types of things that, okay, it's a busy season. But we have to be careful that a season doesn't become life. Because if we're not careful, we can have this busy season that turns into months and years and even decades, and our life just passes away because we have been busy. And the commandment that we're going to look at today is the commandment of Sabbath. And the reason that I said God knows what we need right when we need it is this is a busy season for me right here. You know, the church fiscal year recently ended. We've got district assembly at the end of this week. We're picking corn this week. And for some reason, every year I tell Hannah this, I'm a glutton for punishment. I schedule a board meeting this week too. And every year she says, yes, you are. And you'll probably say the same thing next year. But the fact of the matter is, if we're not careful, we allow these types of things to consume us. That, well, this is a busy season because of this and this and this. Well, when this, and this are done, now we got that, and that, and the busy season continues. And that becomes life. Now, when we talk about the commandment of Sabbath, we recognize that Jesus isn't calling us to this legalistic rule system. The law, the 10 Commandments, were written on stone, and they are an external list of rules that tell us when we disobey God, tell us when we break His law. Well, Jesus calls us something different, and we can cling to the promise in Ezekiel 36, where God can remove from us a heart of stone and give us a heart of flesh. He will put His Spirit in us and write His law on our hearts so that we can follow His decrees and obey His regulations. That is where we are moving towards. That is what Jesus has called us to do. But in the midst of this, we have to remember the Sabbath. I say have to. If practiced correctly, it means we get to. It's a blessing for us to have a Sabbath because we can find delight in it. And there are certain things that we can find delight in. You know, you sit around with old friends and you reminisce about this or that and share good memories. And it's fun to observe those types of things. And those can be traditions. You get together with someone every once in a while and it can be a part of a tradition in your relationship. But we do have to answer the question of what does it mean to keep the Sabbath? How do we keep the Sabbath? And really, at the base of it, is it means that we cease ordinary work and I put and do religious exercise. Now, if I say we got to do religious exercise, that doesn't get the heart pumping. That doesn't get the adrenaline flowing. No one's like, religious exercise, let's go, right? It's not like you're at body pump or spin class or whatever exercise group that you're part of. It's not like you're excited about that. But when we recognize that we stop the ordinary and we do something different with the focus of God, of Jesus. And so that's what I mean when I say religious exercise. You know, the commandment, when we'll get to that here in a little bit, tells us that we are to remember to observe the Sabbath. We're to remember it. When we talk about remembering the Sabbath, it's not just about acknowledging that this is the Sabbath. If you try to do that in your marriage, you're going to have a pretty poor anniversary. If all you do for remembering your anniversary is, well, acknowledge today's my anniversary, you're not going to have a very happy spouse. So you have to do something different. So the Sabbath is not just about saying this is the Sabbath. It's about doing something different, focusing on God. And so you can think of like your anniversary flowers, dinner, chocolate, movie, whatever, something different. Because God calls us to make it holy, to set it apart, to sanctify it, to set it aside as something different and special. Because the Sabbath differentiates between the ordinary and the extraordinary. That's kind of what's at stake here, is the Sabbath says stop the ordinary, and now we're going to focus on the extraordinary. Now, when we think about the Sabbath, I like to have the conversation of, well, is today the Sabbath? And the Jews would highly disagree that today is the Sabbath, in case we're curious. But a lot of followers of Jesus refer to it today as the Sabbath. And I really don't care where you fall on this side. I don't have a strong point either way. But today is the Lord's Day. It's the day that Jesus rose from the grave, and we celebrate it is the Lord's Day. If we want to say that means it's the Sabbath, that's perfectly fine with me. If you want to have Sabbath on Saturday and the Lord's Day on Sunday, I don't really care. If that's fine with me. You do what you want to do. But today is the Lord's Day because Jesus rose from the grave on Sunday. And so every week we gather celebrating that we serve a Savior, not who is dead, but who is alive. And so this is what we're doing when we come here. And so we no longer, like they did in the Old Testament, we no longer look for the Exodus for salvation. So remember, God delivered his people from slavery, from Egypt. He delivered them and then brought them into the promised land. We're no longer longing for that or looking for that for our salvation. We're looking for Jesus. The salvation he's given us now and the future salvation that he will give to the fullness of redemption. But what I find is interesting is that the Sabbath from the Jewish perspective was the last day of the week. It was the seventh day. So for us as Christians, we gather on Sunday, and so it's the first day of the week. You look at your calendars, it goes Sunday is the first day, right? So it starts our week. Usually we talk about Monday being the first day of the week because we go back to work and we dread Mondays or something of that nature. But Sunday starts our week recognizing who Jesus is. But we have to make sure we avoid legalism. With any of the Old Testament laws or any of the rules and regulations that we impose on ourselves today, we need to make sure that we avoid legalism. But one of the things that we do when we gather here today, remember, is that we're celebrating the fact that Jesus is alive. So today is a celebration. Every Sunday, throughout the entire year, we gather celebrating that Jesus is alive. If Jesus wasn't alive, we wouldn't be here right now. So it's a celebration. And if we come to this religious exercise, this activity, focusing on God, recognizing that it's a celebration, it changes our mindset because it's a call to freedom. We have 6 other days, and today is different. Now, when we think about the Sabbath, we've got 6 days of work and then 1 day of rest. What this calls us to do is make sure that we work diligently on those 6 days. If you're a lazy bum on those 6 days, you can't rest on the Sabbath. But if we diligently work on the time that God has given us to work, then we can rest when he calls us to rest. So we have to prepare. See, observing the Sabbath is not just about showing up. We've got to make sure we're ready for what Jesus wants for us. And sometimes that means preparing we do a lot of work on the back end. So for instance, I come and I'm delivering a sermon. Right? I didn't just decide 5 minutes before I got up here, what am I going to preach on today? Let's jot a few things down. Like there was preparation that went into it. Now, there are times where Jesus can change the preparation. We have these plans, and the Holy Spirit can completely adjust them and throw them all over the place, and that's perfectly fine. But if we rely on the spontaneity of the Holy Spirit, then we're not actually preparing for the movement of the Holy Spirit. So we have to prepare. It's like, you cooking a meal. It's not just you throw something together for Thanksgiving dinner. Yeah, it's called Thanksgiving dinner. Thanks, Roy. But we have a supper dinner debate in my house. But I'm a lunch and supper person. But anyway, that won't cost you any extra today. But So we prepare, we have to plan, we have to get things done so that we can then rest. But I think the bigger issue is we have a legalistic side of thing that we have to guard against, which is what Jesus encountered multiple times in the Gospels, particularly with the religious leaders. And in Matthew chapter 12, we find that he has a very specific interaction with the religious leaders. So what's going on is that Jesus is walking through a field on the Sabbath, and his disciples are hungry, and so they pick heads of grain off the stalks and begin to eat them. But some of the Pharisees saw them doing this. Pharisees were religious leaders. They saw them doing this, and they protested. And they said, look, your disciples are breaking the law by gathering grain on the Sabbath. And Jesus said to them, haven't you read the scriptures, what David did when he and his companions were hungry? David went into the house of the Lord, and they ate the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests were allowed to eat. And haven't you read what the law of Moses said, that when a priest is on duty in the temple, they can work on the Sabbath to fulfill their responsibilities? I tell you, there is one here who's even greater than the temple. But you would not have condemned my disciples if you knew the scripture when it says, I want you to show mercy, not offer sacrifices. For the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. And then Jesus went into their synagogue where he noticed a man with a deformed hand. The Pharisees asked him, does the law allow a person to work on the Sabbath by healing? They were hoping he would say yes, so they could bring charges against him. And Jesus answered them, if you had a sheep that fell into a well on the Sabbath, would you work to pull it out? Of course you would. And how much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Yes, the law permits a person to do good on the Sabbath. Then he told the man, hold out your hand. And the man held out his hand, and it was restored to be just like the other one. And the Pharisees called a meeting to see how they might plot to kill Jesus. So that's a legalistic interaction that Jesus has with the religious leaders, because him and his disciples are walking, and they need sustenance. Remember, the ministry that Jesus had was a little different than what we have today. Jesus would move from place to place ministering, relying on generosity of others in order for him to survive. Now we have similarities to that, but Jesus didn't have a house to live in. He would go and hope somebody would welcome him into his house. That's a lot different than today of what we would expect from a hospitality standpoint. We might be generous and offer somebody money, but inviting them into their home, a stranger into their home, like they say, don't even pick up hitchhikers anymore, right? It's against the law to pick up hitchhikers, let alone welcome them into your home to stay for a few days. So that is the context which Jesus and his disciples are ministering, are living. So they pick grain in order to eat, in order to have sustenance, in order to have food. Now, there are certain things that were permitted on the Sabbath, certain basic chores that had to be done. Remember, this is an agrarian culture. Agriculture was everything to them, crops and livestock. And if you have livestock, you have to take care of them every single day. Right? And it is work to take care of the livestock. And so there were allowances made in order to get the chores done that needed to be done. But the religious leaders were trying to catch Jesus in a trap. They were trying to set a legal trap so that they could have some grounds in order to bring charges against him, in order to really get rid of him. So this legal trap was trying to find a way for Jesus to be in error, claiming that Jesus was not honoring the Sabbath, was not honoring the law. Now, we have the tendency to do this as well. Maybe not set traps like the religious leaders, maybe we do, but like the religious leaders, we want a list of do's and don'ts for every single situation. I mean, you look at our legal system and how many laws there are. I love clicking on articles that say old-fashioned laws that are still on the books in certain states and just how ridiculous they may be. But the fact of the matter, we have so many laws and rules for our society. Sometimes as followers of Jesus, we want that too. If the Bible would just tell me what to do in this situation, I would feel a lot better about it. But the point of the Bible is not to give you a legalistic set of rules for every situation that you might encounter. Because you know what? The more laws and rules we have, the more we look for loopholes. The more we try to push the boundaries. Because in all honesty, for the most part, with our legal system, what we're trying to do, what is the minimum expectation so that I can avoid punishment? How fast can I go before the police officer is going to pull me over? What's the least amount of taxes I can pay and not have any fault? Like we're trying to do the minimum for the government. And Jesus doesn't call us just to do the minimum because the minimum doesn't honor Jesus. If we would apply the same principle to Jesus, it would be, what's the bare minimum I can do and still get to heaven? What's the bare minimum I can do and avoid hell? That does not honor Jesus. So Jesus knows the religious leaders, knows their intent, and so he goes to David. David is somebody that they revere, that they hold really high esteem. Now, David wasn't perfect. He made some colossal mistakes. But still, the religious leaders, he was on the Mount Rushmore for the Old Testament, and so was Moses. And so Jesus appeals to both David and Moses and say, hey, you know what? They had exceptions. They weren't legalistic about this. There were things that they could do if they had a need or if there was a requirement. It wasn't about following the letter of the law. It was about following the heart of the law. The priests are trying to trap Jesus. They're trying to catch him in something where they can bring charges to him, but Jesus exposes their legalism. Say, this is what you're saying, but really, you're just trying to promote your own agenda. See, what the Sabbath does is not trying to promote our agenda. It's not trying to be legalistic. It's that the Sabbath differentiates between the extraordinary and the ordinary. It differentiates between the things that are God and things that are not. Now, when Jesus says that the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, he is not saying that he is above the law. God is not one of those elected officials who makes laws that don't apply to them. The official makes a law, well, I'm above the law. I don't have to follow this. The law that God established is because of who God is. This is God's character being revealed to us. Rest is part of who God is, and he created us to be people who need rest as well. So it's not a legalistic thing. It was a principle of understanding of how we are created. See, Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, but he fulfills the heart of the law. See, God is sovereign over everything. There's nothing that exists in which God is not sovereign. He's sovereign over the Sabbath. He's sovereign over the Old Testament. He's sovereign over us. He's sovereign over everything that exists. And so for us to come and question who God is and his character is really questioning, is he actually God? Is he who he says he is? But Jesus unpacks the heart of the law here. Particularly if there's a sheep that's trapped, you would take care of your livestock. You would do that, and people are more important. And so he exposes the legalism here, saying that doing good is good. Now, we have to be careful that we don't use this to justify everything we can do. Well, I can't take a break. I'm just doing good. I'm doing the Lord's work here, so we get a little self-righteous about it, right? High and mighty. Or we justify it somehow. That Jesus says saving an animal is something we allow. How much more valuable is actually saving a person or helping another person? But the thing about the Sabbath, a question comes to mind is, in order to fulfill the Sabbath, is attending a worship service like this required? Like if we don't do this right here, right now, are we breaking the Sabbath? Are we not doing what Jesus has called us to do? So I obviously think there's value in what we do here. Otherwise, we would try to make changes. I don't think God takes attendance necessarily, but I also don't think that God is willy-nilly about his requirements for us. It's not one of those things God is up there with, well, you attended 85% of the time, so you pass. We're getting to the legalistic side of things, and what's the bare minimum I can do and still get to heaven, right? That's not what God calls us to. But instead of asking, is this required, maybe we should ask, what would it look like for this to be a rejuvenating, worshiping experience? An experience where I find rest. Not because I got a nap, but because I found Jesus. I encountered Jesus. Because that's what we're trying to do here. Right? When we pray, the issue is not that we pray over the scheduled thing. The issue is that we seek Jesus, because that is what we are here doing. So what would it look like for our worship time, the times we gather, whether it's this, whether it's a discipleship, whether it's a fellowship, whatever it is, what would it look like for us to find rest in this? Because we can find rest even when we're working hard. We can find rest in the cornfield. I mean, we're going to be tired, we're going to need a nap, but we can find spiritual rest. And what would it look like if we did that? Now, part of I think what happens sometimes is we come to this setting and maybe our motives or our attitudes aren't exactly where they need to be. See, if we come to this setting wanting to receive and that's it, we're going to leave dissatisfied. If we come to this setting needing the approval of somebody else, we're going to be dissatisfied. If we come to this setting not spiritually right with Jesus, we're going to be dissatisfied. If we come to this setting in ways that aren't right with Jesus, we're not going to find rest. Now, there are times we have stress, and I don't want to downplay that. You're not going to leave every worship gathering on fire for Jesus and say, "Whoo, I'm just rested today." Right? You're not going to do that. Some of you take naps during this time anyway, so I don't know. But I just have this soothing voice that puts some of you to sleep, don't I? But we have to make sure we don't confuse being physically tired with needing spiritual rest. Sometimes we need a nap. Sometimes we need food to get us to where we need to be. But every time we need Jesus. And we need to find rest in Jesus. We're not going to find rest in the food we eat or the sleep we get or the shows we binge watch. We're going to find rest in Jesus. And these are temporary needs that the world says, hey, I'll take care of you. You know, you don't even have to change the channel. The next episode will start and you have to do nothing. Right? You don't even have to watch commercials anymore. Right? So there's no building bathroom breaks, but that's okay. We'll figure it out. But we have to make sure we recognize what is rest. And rest is not escaping in these worldly things that are created. Rest is not in just a nap. Though we are created to need sleep, we are created to need food, we have to make sure we understand what rest is. See, I think it's interesting to recognize that sin keeps no Sabbath. Sin doesn't rest. It doesn't. Sin is relentless to try to trip you up, to try to trap you, try to get you to believe that this is what your life is missing. But you know what the Sabbath should be? A foretaste of glory divine. A foretaste of what Jesus wants for us. A time where there's no more sickness, no more pain, no more suffering, no more responsibilities, no more bills, no more worldly tasks. Let's say there's no more responsibilities. Heaven's not going to be a place where we just twiddle our thumb. Don't get me wrong on that. But no more worldly cares. That's what Sabbath calls us to do. Remember, in order to take the Sabbath, in order to have the Sabbath, in order to keep it holy, in order to keep the Sabbath as a time that is set apart, we have to get ready for it. Because holiness requires preparation. Holiness won't just accidentally happen. Now, holiness only happens because the power of God breaks into our life. And sometimes that can happen spontaneously when we're least expecting it. But holiness almost always happens when we are diligently seeking Jesus. You're not going to drift into holiness. You're going to work into holiness with the power of Jesus working in your life. So we can think of the things that we do that give us rest in Jesus. You know, worshiping in songs, singing songs, listening to songs, praying, reading our Bibles, spending time alone. Some of you, depending on your generation, might not be too difficult. But some of us, you know what's real difficult? To sit in a room of silence with no devices on. That's really hard. But we can find rest in that if we actually took the discipline to do it. So what would it look like for us to do that? But let's come to the commandment. Exodus chapter 20, is where we find the Ten Commandments, and this commandment is starting in verses 8 and 9. It says, remember to observe the Sabbath by keeping it holy. You have 6 days each week for ordinary work. So remembering the Sabbath requires intentionality. Each week we have a Sabbath. We have 6 days for ordinary work, and on the seventh day is a Sabbath. What would it look like for us to keep the Sabbath? Now remember, we are people who are created in the image of God. When God created us, He created us in His image. God is a God who took rest. He worked for 6 days on creation, and then He took rest. And He has designed us to be the same. We are people that can work for so long, and then we need rest. But when the commandment says, remember the Sabbath by keeping it holy, that word holy means sacred, or it means set apart. It's different than the other. So that's why I'm contrasting ordinary and extraordinary. We have all this stuff we do on a regular, normal basis, and then we have something different, which is the Sabbath. There were several things in the Old Testament that reminded the Israelites that they were a holy people, a separate people, a people that were set apart. In Leviticus 19, one of my favorite verses, talks about not wearing clothing woven over 2 different kinds of material. And the point was, not that there was some contamination issue, but that the people were set apart. They were holy, pure. They were being different, not intermingled with other things. We as people are to be set apart, and we have to keep the Sabbath as holy and set apart. What I find this interesting, though, there were a few different ancient cultures around the Israelite time that used 7 days as their weekly calendar. So each week was 7 days. Israel is the only group in which the 7th day is this holy, reverent day that's set apart for God. All the other groups, the 7th day was a day of woe, a day of misfortune, a day that just wasn't looked good upon. So it was just really a complete shift that the Israelites had something different. The 7th day wasn't a day of misfortune. It was a day of God's blessing, a day of God's goodness upon them. And the 7th day was their day of rest. They do all their ordinary work on 6 days. What does ordinary mean? That's an interesting question of we're supposed to work, rest, but not be idle. What does ordinary mean? And I think we have to define that for ourselves. And partially, I think, what is the outcome of our work? What does that look like? I mean, something like you pay your bills would be ordinary weekly or monthly activities. And so that probably would not fall under extraordinary. So we have to make sure we take a step back and what am I doing? Is this ordinary or would this be extraordinary? And maybe that word extraordinary is too big because, listening to worship songs, would we consider that extraordinary? I mean, I do that every day of the week. But what would it look like if I took a step back and listened to them just to find rest? Not for entertainment, not to have noise in the background, but to find rest in Jesus. And so we have to understand our mindset, our perspective of what are we trying to accomplish. But one of the things about the Sabbath that's interesting is that the Sabbath breaks up the monotony of life. If all 7 days every week are the same, it's the same over and over and over and over again. And it's funny, you go on vacation, sometimes it's hard to remember what day it is, right? Right? You're not in your normal routine. Right? If I miss church on Sunday, my whole week is thrown off because I can hardly remember what day it is. But the Sabbath breaks up the monotony of life. It resets us. It restores us. It helps us understand who Jesus is, and it centers us. But as I said, Sabbath is more than just physical rest, but it can be physical rest. Taking a nap can be part of Sabbath. even recreation, or doing something like a craft or painting or coloring can be Sabbath. Now, television, movies can be Sabbath. I hesitate to say they're Sabbath because they're so accessible. So we're so consumed by the amount of television sometimes and the screens, social media, that I'm not sure if those actually are rest anymore. Because those are ordinary. That's what life seems to be now. But if we look in our world today, one of the things I struggle with is, what if I make others work on the Sabbath? Now, there are some exceptions. Jesus gave the exception of, if your sheep fell in a well, you'd work to get it out. Okay, healthcare professionals. Okay, no issue with them working on Sabbath, whatever that may be. But if I go to the restaurant, I'm making somebody else work on Sunday, right? If I go to the store to pick up some groceries, I'm making somebody else work on Sunday, right? Some of you remember when everything was shut down in the community on Sundays. Now, a lot of retailers and restaurants wouldn't be able to survive if they didn't have the revenue from Sunday. So has our nation, has our society gained anything because all these places are open on Sunday? I don't know. I've only known places to be open on Sunday. I haven't really known anything different. And, I didn't even think of this, but the newspaper used to not have any paper on Sundays. It was World War I when that changed. Because in World War I, the news was so important, so pressing, because of all that was happening from a global standpoint, that the newspaper started printing newspapers on Sunday. Now, if people only get one newspaper a week, they get the Sunday paper. Because it's the biggest, there's the most in there, because it's so popular. And so that is where our world has moved. And so Sabbath is really important because it differentiates between the extraordinary and the ordinary. It separates those two. But the commandment continues a little bit further in verse 10. It says, but the seventh day is to be a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, or any foreigners living among you. For in 6 days God made the heavens, the earth, the seas, and everything in them. And on the seventh day he rested. That is why God blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. So we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to Sabbath? What does it mean for me to take a Sabbath? And that can be different at different times. Sometimes it can be do nothing. Sometimes it can be recreation. Sometimes it can be reading your Bible, sitting in the presence of God, having conversations about who God is. See, God rested on the seventh day. He created for 6 days, and he rested on the seventh. He calls us to have that rhythm in our life, to work for 6 days and rest on the seventh. So God is establishing a new social order. And if you take a step back and look at this and consider it, this is pretty radical, especially at that time of age. In our society today, it's a little hard for us to wrap our minds around it, because no matter whether you're rich or poor, we have structures from a working standpoint we have a traditional 40-hour work week. And there may be some people who have multiple jobs and they work more than that. But if you work more than 40, you get overtime and you get other things. And employers don't want to pay you overtime all the time, usually. And so we have certain parameters. And so we work for 40 hours and then we have rest. And if you work for 40 hours, then you have at least 2 days off every week, which is radical considering what was happening in Jesus' day or even Moses' day when the law was given. God is calling his people, you need rest. You need to be people who don't work yourself tirelessly. And so I think we first and foremost have to admit we are created to need rest. So we don't feel guilty about needing rest. We recognize rest is good because it rejuvenates us. It restores us. It helps us to be who God created us to be. So we need rest. And we have a responsibility to make sure that we set that agenda of what does it mean for me to get rest. And parents are responsible for their kids. And so as parents, we need to say, what does it mean to get rest? But we have a problem here, I think. And I think comedian Jerry Seinfeld has a stand-up about this. But you can talk about kids and parents. They will say the same thing but mean completely different things. If you walked into church today and you came up to me and said, well, what did you guys do this weekend? If I would say, we did nothing, you would view that as a positive thing of, oh, I got to do nothing. And it was glorious. If you asked a kid and they said, what'd you do this weekend? And they said nothing, they would say, it was terrible. We did nothing. I can't imagine any worse way to spend my time. Right? And so sometimes doing nothing is what we need to do as adults. Kids, that's a little difficult for them. But the fact that as adults, we need to set the agenda for our kids, for our families. That if we don't rest, then we're not obeying God. We're also not living to our full potential because God has created us to be people who need rest. Now, the commandment expands to your household, those who work for you, your livestock. We don't work these people, these things on the Sabbath. Now remember, God gave the Ten Commandments when most labor was manual labor type stuff. And so the rest included physical nature, but also included mental and spiritual as well. So it's interesting when you look at the Old Testament, a lot of the laws, the laws are spiritual, but there's also some humanitarian concepts in there. Of treat your workers well. Of treat others with respect. Don't take advantage of others. God created in 6 days, and so the seventh day is a weekly pause to remember God's grace and salvation. To remember the blessings, the goodness that He has poured out upon us. Now, as followers of Jesus, we are called to work, we are called to serve, and we are called to rest. But make sure we take a step back for a minute. God is not a slave driver. The beginning of Exodus 20, in verse 2, God reminds the people of their relationship. He sets the tone for these commandments. He says, I am the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. God, that defines their relationship. God's relationship with Israel is based off His deliverance of them. He chose them, He saved them, He delivered them. He says, I have delivered you, now trust me. He says, I'm not a slave driver like the Egyptians were. I'm a God who delivers you. I'm a God of freedom. I'm a God that's different than these other rulers in this world. So when we Sabbath, we differentiate between the ordinary and the extraordinary because we serve an extraordinary God who is different from all the things in the world. So to keep the Sabbath means to keep it holy, to keep it sacred, to set it apart, which if we come together and we're celebrating, if we take the Sabbath and we're celebrating who God is and what He's done for us, it avoids the trap of legalism. Because the Sabbath is not a day for business as usual. It's a day we set apart for God. And sometimes that means recreation. Sometimes that means physical rest. Sometimes that means eating good food. It can mean all those things. But it's about setting it apart and aside for God. And we have to be careful not to come up with excuses. Because we are really good at excuses. We're really good at saying, yeah, but. Oh, this is just a busy season. I don't have time to not do this. I've got to get this done. What does that look like for you to make sure that you take rest? Now, if we're honest with ourselves, some of you work 6 days a week at a job that pays you, and then you spend the other day working like a dog tirelessly for Jesus, and you're actually never resting. We can sometimes blur the lines of, well, I'm serving in the name of Jesus, so I'm okay. we need to make sure we take rest. Now, some of you might view that as a license to do nothing. That's not what Jesus is calling us to do. We need to be people who serve, who are actively engaging in Jesus. Because if we come here just receiving from others, then we're missing the point of why we gather. We must serve, but we also must recognize that it doesn't depend on me. That's part of what Sabbath does for us. It reminds us, you know what, the world can function without you, without your gifts, without your experience, without your resources. But what's interesting, we see studies on this, that when we are rested and rejuvenated, we're actually more productive. We actually perform at a higher standard. So somebody who works 40 hours a week works less than somebody who works 60 hours a week, but once you get over so many hours a day, your productivity goes way, way down. Once you keep working longer and longer and longer, your productivity suffers. God created us to need people who rest. So when we rest, we're able to do the work that God has called us to do. But it's not about better quality. Sabbath is not just so you can produce higher quality. Sabbath is so we can get closer to God and be restored in Him. I like the story of two pastors who were talking, and one pastor was taking a vacation, and the other pastor said, well, I don't take a vacation because the devil never takes a vacation. And the pastor taking a vacation, well, I never let the devil be my example in the first place. God rested. Sin never takes a break. God rested, not as though He was indifferent to sin or ignoring that, but we have extraordinary versus ordinary. And what is the ordinary and what is the extraordinary? Sabbath is doing something different. So when you think about Sabbath, one thing we can think of is maybe you don't do something on the Sabbath. Maybe you don't watch TV on the Sabbath. Maybe you don't drink pop on the Sabbath. Or maybe you only do something on the Sabbath. Maybe you only eat chocolate on the Sabbath, or whatever it may be. You either only do something on the Sabbath or you don't do something only on the Sabbath as a way to make it different. Because sometimes those external practices can really help us internally. It can help us set apart as special. Unplug from the normal routine of life. So when we talk about the Sabbath, we need to serve others. Here's one. Maybe on the Sabbath, you don't spend any money. That'd be interesting. What would that look like? My point is not to say you should do this or that, but to say, what would make the Sabbath different for you? How could you keep the Sabbath as sacred, as set apart, as holy? Because if we don't intentionally differentiate between the ordinary and the extraordinary, it's not going to happen. We need rest. So that's why God created the Sabbath for us.